Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone, and tonight I'm joined by my good friend, Dee Pierce, the host
Hello.
of Around the World with Dee and Friends. Hello, Dee. How are you?
Hello. I'm doing great. How you doing, Joe?
I'm doing okay, thanks. I'm a little hoarse tonight. I don't know why exactly, but but Bonnie will be here with a cup of tea in a minute, and
Oh, that's good.
that may fix my hoarseness, I hope. Anyway, our topics for tonight are the Kellogg framing is a disaster for Donald Trump. Uh, we're also going to be looking at how Donald Trump seems to be waiting for Xi to make a move on tariffs. It may be a long wait. We'll also be commenting on an interview that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, had with Margaret. I guess her last name is Brennan uh, from CBS. I guess she's a leading interviewer these days in the mainstream.
Okay.
And she got the prize of being the one to interview Sergei Lavrov,
Hmm.
which was an interesting experience for her, I'm sure. We'll be talking about that. And then there was a very, very striking interview that Larry Wilkerson, Colonel Wilkerson, retired Colonel Wilkerson, the former aide to Colin Powell when he was Secretary of State, and a professor emeritus, okay, at William and Mary, gave uh, to Glenn Bedeson.
Hmm.
Glenn is currently a professor at, I think, the Southeastern University in Norway, or the University of Southeastern Norway. But he's written a very good book on balance of power, okay, and international relations. So he had a very interesting conversation with Larry Wilkerson. It was, uh, I think, what Larry did in this interview is really pretty stunning. Uh, he just exposed everybody in the world to the reality of how U.S. foreign policy happens. And I just thought that was a wonderful thing to bring to our folks. And then, in addition, uh, if we get a chance, I did not originally schedule this, but if we get a chance, there's a new article. Uh, it's a Mike Whitney article, and it's about what really happened at Bandar Abbas. That's the Iranian site where this huge explosion, okay, has taken place. And I believe this is the first really good article on that I've seen. So if we get a chance to get into it, I would certainly like to. Anyway, I guess it's probably time for us to share on Facebook in order to get this started.
Yes.
So I'm going to begin doing that. And then
Yes, I'm sharing. And I'm gonna go over to X and reshare it on X.
to X, formerly known as Twitter. We'll never let anybody forget that it's
Right.
formerly known as Twitter because we hope that Elon sells it and it becomes Twitter once again.
Yes, that would be nice.
But he probably never will. So
Okay.
da da da.
Sharing.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome. And I shared the YouTube earlier over to Blue Sky.
Oh, good. Yeah, I saw that actually. That was good. Thank you.
You let people know you got a show going on.
Yeah,
Those that don't know.
we cannot stream to Blue Sky yet, can we?
No.
They still don't have the streaming capability there.
Nope.
That's too bad. I'll begin by sharing the screen now
Okay.
and going to the first article on the Kellogg framework is a disaster for Trump. That article, okay, is by Alistair Crook, one of our favorites here on this program,
Yes.
in spite of the fact that we always seriously critique him because of on the debt and the deficit,
Right.
which are frankly primitive Austerian views.
Yes.
So there's General Kellogg talking to President Donald Trump with President Zelensky looking on from a position that is almost under the table. It's an interesting little graphic. All of Kellogg's underlying assumptions, and by the way, thank you very much for the tea, honey. You're welcome. All of Kellogg's underlying assumptions lacked any basis in reality, yet Trump seemingly took them on trust. It's amazing who Donald trusts and who he fails to trust. I probably shouldn't be calling him Donald, but I have to remind myself to refer to him as President Trump. Anyway, political warfare in Washington is endemic, but the body count at the Pentagon has started to rise precipitously. 3 of Secretary of Defense Hegseth's top advisors were placed on leave and then fired. The war continues with the secretary now in the firing line. Why this matters is that the Hegseth attrition comes amid fierce internal debates in the Trump administration about Iran policy. Hawks want a definitive elimination of all Iran's nuclear and weapons capabilities, whilst many restrainers, quote unquote, warn against military escalation. I guess I'm not in the administration, but I have certainly am one of the restrainers. Hegseth reportedly was amongst those warning against an intervention in Iran. God, I find myself on the same side as Hegseth. What's that about? The recent Pentagon dismissals have all been identified as restrainers. One of the latter, Dan Caldwell, formerly Hegseth's advisor and an Army veteran, wrote a post slamming the, quote, Iran hawks, unquote, and subsequently was fired. Oh, he was fired for exercising his right of free speech. Well, no, I'm kidding there. People who advise the president don't have, or the Secretary of Defense don't have the right of free speech. They're always supposed to echo the party line. He was later interviewed by Tucker Carlson. Notably, Caldwell describes in scathing terms America's wars in Iraq and Syria, quote, criminal, unquote. This adverse sentiment concerning America's earlier wars is a rising theme, it seems, amongst the U.S. vets today. How about Afghanistan? Doesn't that qualify as criminal also? The three Pentagon staffers essentially were fired, not as, quote, leakers, unquote, but for talking Hegseth out of supporting war on Iran, it would appear. The Israeli firsters have not given up on that war. I'm really puzzled by all this because if the three Pentagon staffers were originally hired by Hegseth, and Hegseth is the secretary, who fired these three advisors? If Hegseth didn't fire them, who fired them? Inquiring minds want to know. Anyway, the inflamed fault lines between hawks and traditionalist Republicans, quote unquote, bleed across into the Ukraine issue, even if the faction membership may alter a tad. Israeli firsters and U.S. hawks more generally are behind both the war on Russia and the maximalist demands on Iran. Conservative commentator Fred Bauer observes that when it comes to Trump's own war impulses, they are conflicted. Quote, influenced by the Vietnam of his youth, Trump seems deeply averse to long-term conflicts. Yet at the same time, Trump admires a politics of strength and swagger. That means taking out Iranian generals, launching airstrikes on the Houthis, and boosting the defense budget to $1 trillion. Hegseth's potential exit, should the campaign for his removal succeed, could cause the struggle to grow fiercer. Its first casualty is already apparent. Trump's hope to bring a quick end to the Ukraine conflict is over. I have to add here, I don't understand that. I don't understand why Trump doesn't just wake up tomorrow morning and announce and back up the announcement with executive orders that we are ending all further aid to Ukraine. Follow that up also with further words saying it's not his war. He never wanted it. He never got into it. He always thought it was a bad idea. And he doesn't think we should be involved. We've done our best. That's all we can do. It was stupid for the Ukrainians to take on the Russians. And even if the U.S. had a lot to do with it, he did not have a lot to do with it. And he's not going to continue it. I don't understand why he just doesn't announce it. I know people have said that some people in his circle have told him that if he does that, he'll be accused of losing Ukraine in the same way the Dems in times long gone by were accused of losing China. Never mind that Ukraine was never Trump's to lose, and never mind that China was never the U.S.'s to lose also. But such silly slogans, sometimes very effective in politics. And of course, the Democrats have been itching to be able to accuse Trump of losing Ukraine. We know that. Or we can assume that. That's a pretty good assumption. Maybe that's why Trump hasn't ended it. But now that he hasn't ended it, it's become his war. And he's never wanted it to be his war. So he better grow a pair real quickly and end it right now. This week, the Trump team, including both warring factions, Rubio, Witkoff, and General Kellogg met in Paris with a variety of European and Ukrainian representatives. At the meeting, a Russian-Ukrainian unilateral ceasefire proposal was mooted by the U.S. Delegation. After the meeting at the airport, Rubio plainly said the ceasefire plan was a take it or leave it type of U.S. initiative. The various sides, Russia, Kyiv, and the European members of the coalition, the willing, quote unquote, had only days to accept it, or else the U.S. was out, quote unquote, and would wash its hands of the conflict. The framework presented, as reported, is almost maybe 95% unadulteratedly that previously proposed by General Kellogg, i.e., it is his plan. First aired in April of 2024. And a more moronic plan, I might add, has never been advanced in this context. It appears that the, quote, Kellogg formula, I can't resist the temptation to say that General Kellogg should go back to eating cereal, was adopted then as the Trump platform. I know it was a cheap shot. Trump was at the time in mid-campaign and unlikely to have been following the complicated minutiae of the Ukraine war too closely. General Kellogg is also likely the source for Trump's optimism that the ending to the Ukraine war could come with a click of Trump's fingers through the limited application of asymmetric pressures and threats on both belligerents by Trump, and with the timing decided in Washington. In short, the plan represented a Beltway consensus that the U.S. could implement a negotiated end state with the terms aligned to U.S. and Ukrainian interests. Oh, God, how can so many of these people live in such a fantasy world? Kellogg's implicit assumptions were that Russia is highly vulnerable to a sanctions threat. Its economy perceived as being fragile, that it had suffered unsustainably high casualties, and the war was at a stalemate. In a pig's eye it was. Thus, Kellogg persuaded Trump that Russia would readily agree to the ceasefire terms proposed, albeit terms that were constructed around patently flawed underlying assumptions about Russia and its presumed weaknesses. Kellogg's influence and false premises were all too evident when Trump in January, having stated that Russia had lost 1 million men in the war, then went on to say that, quote, Putin is destroying Russia by not making a deal, adding seemingly as an aside that Putin may already have made up his mind to, quote, not to make a deal, unquote. He further claimed that Russia's economy is in ruins, and most notably said that he would consider sanctioning or tariffing Russia. In a subsequent Truth Social post, Trump writes, quote, I'm going to do Russia, whose economy is failing, and President Putin a very big favor, and favor was all in caps, unquote. All of Kellogg's underlying assumptions lacked any basis in reality. I think Alistair should have put all in caps, all in all caps. Of Kellogg's underlying assumptions lacked any basis in reality. Yet Trump seemingly took them on trust. And despite Steve Witkoff's subsequent 3 lengthy personal meetings with President Putin, in which Putin repeatedly stated that he would not accept any ceasefire until a political framework had been first agreed, the Kellogg contingent continued to blandly assume that Russia would be forced to accept Kellogg's détente because of the claimed serious, quote, setbacks, unquote, Russia had suffered in Ukraine. Evidently, Mr. Trump never called his old friend, Colonel McGregor, to double check those assumptions that Kellogg was giving him. If he had done so, he would have gotten an earful. Given this history, unsurprisingly, the ceasefire framework terms outlined by Rubio this week in Paris reflected those more suited to a party at the point of capitulation rather than that of a state anticipating achieving its objectives by military means. In essence, the Kellogg Plan looked to bring a U.S., quote, win, unquote, on terms aligned to a desire to keep open the option for continuing attritional war on Russia. So what is the Kellogg Plan? At base, it seeks to establish a, quote, frozen conflict, frozen along the, quote, line of conflict, with no definitive ban on NATO membership for Ukraine, but rather envisaging a NATO membership that is deferred well into the future. It places no limits on the size of a future Ukrainian army and no restrictions on the type or quantity of armaments held by the Ukrainian forces. It foresees, contrarily, that after the ceasefire, the U.S. might rearm, retrain, and military support a future force, i.e., back to the post-Maidan era of 2014. Going back, in other words, 11 years ago. In addition, no territory would be ceded by Ukraine to Russia, save for Crimea, which alone would be recognized by the U.S. as Russian, the unique sop to Witkoff, unquote, question mark. And Russia would only exercise control, quote unquote, over the 4 oblasts that it currently claims, yet only up to the line of conflict. Territory beyond this line would remain under Ukrainian control. And this links to the Kellogg map. The Zaporozhye nuclear power plant would be neutral territory to be held and managed by the United States. There's no mention made of the cities of Zaporozhye and Kherson that have been constitutionally incorporated into Russia but lie beyond the contact line. Nothing about a political solution apparently was outlined in the plan, and the plan leaves Ukraine free to pursue its claims to all of its former territories, save for only Crimea. Ukrainian territory west of the Dnieper River, however, would be divided into 3 zones of responsibility: British, French, and German zones, i.e., which NATO forces would manage. Finally, no American security guarantees were offered. Rubio subsequently passed details of the plan to Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, who calmly stated that any ceasefire plan should resolve the underlying causes to the conflict in Ukraine as its first task. Witkoff flies to Moscow this week to present this, quote, pig's ear, quote, unquote, of a plan to Putin, seeking his consent. The Europeans and Ukrainians are set to meet next Wednesday in London to give their riposte to Trump. What's next? Most obviously, the Kellogg Plan will not, quote, fly, unquote. Russia will not accept it, and likely Zelensky will not accept it either. Though the Europeans will work to persuade him, hoping to wrong foot the Russians by presenting the plan as the essential spoiler. Reportedly, Zelensky already has rejected the Crimea provision. I don't know who's more stupid, Rubio, Kellogg, Trump, or Zelensky. For the Europeans, the lack of security guarantees or backstop by the U.S. may prove to be a killer for their aspiration to deploy a tripwire troop deployment to Ukraine in the context of a ceasefire. Is Trump really going to wash his hands of Ukraine? Doubtful, given that the U.S. neoconservative institutional leadership will tell Trump that to do so would weaken America's, quote, peace through strength, unquote, narrative. Trump may adopt supporting Ukraine on a low flame, quote unquote, posture, whilst declaring the, quote, war was never his, unquote, as he seeks a, quote, win, unquote, on the business front with Russia. The bottom line is that Kellogg has not served his patron. The U.S. needs effective working relations with Russia. The Kellogg contingent has contributed to Trump's egregious misreading of Russia. Putin is a serious actor who says what he means and means what he says. Colonel McGregor sums it up thus, quote, Trump tends to view the world through the lens of deal-making. Ending the Ukraine war is not about deal-making. This is about the life and death, of nations and peoples. There is no interest in some sort of short fuse deal that is going to elevate Trump and his administration to greatness. There will be no win for Donald Trump personally in any of this. That was never going to be the case. This was originally published at the Strategic Culture Foundation, which of course is an outlet in Russia. I think it's very well put. It's very well written. It's certainly accurate in its analysis of how the Russians are going to respond to this. What say you, Dee?
Well, all along we've been saying the U.S. has been creating their own narrative, that what's been going on the ground, the U.S. was completely opposite of what we were hearing from different sources when it came to Russia and Ukraine. And the U.S. just kept having this narrative that, Russia was in bad shape, Russia's in bad shape, and Ukraine was doing so great and all this other stuff. And we knew it was nonsense.
Yeah, we've known it was nonsense for 3 years.
Yeah. So we waste Russia's time, waste everybody's time, because we've got people in there that are living in a different reality.
Yeah, and the people pushing the narrative were lying about
Yes.
uh, the casualties in the war.
Right.
From the start, they were simply misstating the casualties. They just had it all wrong. It was obvious they had it all wrong.
Hmm.
It was obvious from the buildup of Russian forces. It was obvious from the buildup of the economy in Russia and their success in producing all kinds of equipment and weapons for the war, and their constantly growing army, and their slow incremental taking of more and more territory, and their successful war of attrition, that they were winning and that they were demilitarizing Ukraine in the process, not in any voluntary way, but obviously the Ukrainian effort was requiring more and more and more and more equipment from NATO and from the United States. And that wouldn't have been the case if the Ukrainians were winning the war.
Right.
It was obvious their equipment was being destroyed, that all of the Wunderwaffen were getting destroyed, that the Russian military equipment was superior in every respect.
Exactly. How many times over and over again we've been saying it on the show?
Yes. How many articles have we gone through that gave evidence of that?
Hmm.
That gave evidence of the reality. But anyway, there it is, another dose, of reality from Alistair Crook. I'm very glad we got that. We don't have many people yet. We don't have many comments. We have Evelina and Steve Wolfbrand saying hello. Hello, Steve. Okay, and Evelina. Thank you both for coming. And then we have a lot of people who have not announced themselves, okay, as yet.
Okay.
Let us move on to the second of our pieces. Everybody, please do share and like. I'm sure that Steve and Evelina are already subscribed.
Like, share, subscribe.
Anyway, the next piece is yours, Dee.
Okay.
It's by Mike Whitney,
Okay.
and the name of it is Waiting on She.
Okay.
Some people say it's pronounced as C,
Okay.
but I've
I would.
always thought it was pronounced as she.
Yes. It's me too. Waiting on She. Mike Whitney, April 27th, 2025. Now look at that face on Trump.
Yeah, he looks both annoyed, also somewhat dejected, and very pensive, which is not a frequent pose for him, I don't think.
But meanwhile, he's telling the crowds that, China's calling him. Everybody's calling him. Meanwhile, no one is.
Yeah.
Quote, this is one of the most important days in American history. It's our declaration of economic independence. Jobs and factories will come roaring back into our country. And you see it happening already. We will supercharge our domestic industrial base. President Donald Trump announces unilateral tariffs on 180 countries despite warnings of inflation, recession, and supply chain disruptions. April 2nd, 2025. This is probably the worst economic policy I have ever seen. This There is no way that the policy will bring manufacturing back to the United States and, quote, make America wealthy again. If anything, it'll make us much poorer. Many are saying that this tariff policy is the, quote, end of globalization. I don't think so. This is the end of America's participation in globalization. Molson Hart, Molson Hart, founder and CEO of Vihart, a consumer products company. The purpose of President Trump's tariff policy is not what he says it is. If the goal of the tariffs was to reindustrialize the country and create more jobs in manufacturing, the announcement would have been accompanied by an industrial policy that would outline a coordinated government effort to rebuild America's critical industries. It would have provided details on tax incentives, infrastructure investments, workforce training, government subsidies, and R&D funding, all aimed at achieving Trump's stated objective.
At this point, I want to make a comment. Okay. Uh, I think this paragraph, this quote, assumes that Trump, is rational, and being rational would understand that if he was going to tariff in order to protect industries here, then he had to have the industries to protect. And therefore, he had to have an industrial policy that was going to create those industries or help to rebuild those industries. But we've seen ample evidence that Trump is not a rational actor.
No.
and that Trump, one of the things Trump seems to believe in uh, uh, is a kind of magic. That if he uses the right words, if he wishes for things, okay, sufficiently hard, and that if he adopts some kind of simple policy, such as the tariffs, it's going to have the magical result that he's looking for. I think it's perfectly possible that he believed that these tariffs would provide an incentive for the country to reindustrialize. Okay, I think he actually believed that. So I don't think I agree. If the goal was to reindustrialize, the announcement would have been accompanied by an industrial policy. I think if Democrats were to have announced a program of tariffs, they would have had accompanied it with an industrial policy, probably a very, very comprehensive one, probably involving huge amounts of deficit spending and all kinds of incentives for business of various kinds. But I don't think it's correct to assume that if Trump had a goal of reindustrializing the country, that therefore he would have had an industrial policy to accompany the tariffs. Anyway, please go on.
Well, Trump is never into the details. He always thinks somebody else is going to do it all.
Yeah, that somebody else is going to do it for him and is going to take care of the details. Okay, but of course, these details involve details of government policy.
Yeah, somebody else was going to do that.
But who else was in a position to do that? Who else was in a position to get the Congress to pass the necessary policies? I mean, this required a huge amount of work from Congress.
Exactly. And he just kind of thought somebody was going to do it. He just makes announcements and doesn't, that's about it. There's no follow through. He just, makes the announcement and thinks others are going to do something.
He makes the announcement. He expects others to do the work, but he doesn't even tell them that he expects them to do the work because he never said anything to the Republicans in Congress. I'm going to have big, big tariffs, and that's going to protect American industry. But it's up to you guys to provide the funds to build that industry that would be protected by the tariffs. Because if you don't, this whole thing is just going to be a total failure. And it'll be a failure in the short run anyway, because right now, we don't have too many industries to protect.
Mm.
Anyway, please go on.
By now, late April, Trump would have made numerous public appearances with important banking and business leaders who would have expressed their support for this ambitious project of rebuilding the country into a manufacturing powerhouse. Trump also would have presented an overview of the many public-private agreements that had been made with wealthy capitalists who supported the idea and wanted to participate in its implementation.
Okay, I think that's too much like work
Yeah,
for Trump. Would have taken him off the golf course too often. Now, he did do one thing about that. He made the famous announcements concerning the AI industry. He brought in uh, the head of Oracle, okay, also the head of, also Sam Altman, the head of the AI company. Okay, and also the president of a famous software company. Yeah, we covered that here. Okay, and they had a big meeting. Uh, whose effect was completely nullified a couple of days afterwards because DeepSeek came out with uh, um, its new AI product uh, that seemed to be just as good as Chat the GPT, uh, and was being made available for free. And that sort of put a crimp in things. And I haven't heard much about that project actually since then, but that's really all that Trump did. He didn't do anything else. So please go on.
Okay. Um, but none of these things have happened because there's no industrial policy. Just as there is no expectation that the imposition of onerous duties on foreign imports will magically, quote, bring jobs back to America. It's all a pipe dream aimed at hoodwinking the public. So, what is the tariffs business really all about? Here's how the WSWS answers this question. That's the World Socialist website.
Right.
The real purpose of Trump's tariffs, in the words of socialist Tom Hall, is, quote, to prepare supply chains for world war, especially against China. The administration is promoting a policy which recalls the darkest period of the 20th century under the Nazis, where trade war preceded the outbreak of World War II in September 1939. We find this analysis compelling, but not particularly believable. True, Trump has failed to back his tariff edicts with any solid proposals for rebuilding America's anemic industrial base, but that doesn't mean he's gearing up for a war with China. That seems a little bit of a stretch. Even so, it's worth putting the question to Grok to see if the historical analogy is accurate. Question: did Hitler use the trade war to strengthen supply chains to Germany before the war? Grok: yes. Hitler exploited the global trade war and economic turmoil of the 1930s to strengthen Germany's supply lines and prepare for war. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and subsequent retaliatory tariffs by other nations disrupted global trade, creating opportunities for Germany to pursue autarky, economic self-sufficiency, and secure strategic resources through bilateral agreements. Here's how. Hitler's regime aimed to reduce reliance on imports by boosting domestic production, particularly in agriculture and synthetic materials, fuel rubber. The Nazis' four-year plan, 1936, prioritized rearmament and self-sufficiency to insulate Germany from trade disruptions. Bilateral trade agreements with global trade hampered. Germany negotiated barter deals with smaller nations, especially in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, exploiting weakened economies. The trade war weakened economies globally, making countries more willing to trade with Germany on favorable terms. Control of neighboring economies. Germany's economic influence over Austria and Czechoslovakia before their annexation 1938 to 39 ensured access to their resources and industries, further strengthening supply lines. While the trade war wasn't the sole factor, it created a fragmented global economy that Hitler manipulated to bolster Germany's war machine. By 1939, these efforts gave Germany a robust, though not complete, supply network for the early stages of World War II.
So an interesting question about this. I like the analysis that came out of Grok,
Right.
but I have to raise the question: why ought we to rely on the AI Grok for this? In other words, uh, why shouldn't we ask uh, uh, a number of other AIs and see if they all say the same thing,
Right.
or if there are different theories? I do find it, though, a reasonable analysis. But please go on.
Okay. And Bloomberg, the White House says it's aiming to negotiate trade deals with allies, then confront China together. The strategy is doomed to fail.
I think so too.
Same here. Tariffs won't bring us allies on board against China. So, a case could be made that Trump is thinking along the same lines as Hitler, trying to make the U.S. more self sufficient in the event of a military confrontation with China. That might explain why he is patching up relations with Putin, so he can shift his attention to China. It might also explain his sudden interest in Greenland, which would provide the U.S. with easy access to precious metals, rare earth, and oil and gas reserves in case war breaks out in the Asia Pacific. The de facto seizure of the Panama Canal could fit within this same paradigm as it relates to the control of critical sea lanes and maritime passageways. These are all actions you would expect the government to take if they were planning a long-term conflict with a peer competitor located halfway around the world. But we're still not convinced that this is the opening volley in a war with China. We think it's the shock and awe phase of an aggressive containment strategy that seeks to isolate and encircle China without actually veering into a shooting war.
So I have to add here. Uh, I think his tariffs, as implemented, certainly have a considerable amount of shock. But I don't think there's a lot of awe there.
Right.
Please go on.
And I was going to say, China is finding other markets for the things we're not taking.
Oh yeah, China doesn't seem to be having any problem at all. Also, uh, their trade with us amounted to only 3% of their GDP. So all they have to do to make up the 3% is to use some stimulus spending with their consumers, and they could easily take up all the slack. It's only 3% of GDP.
Right.
So all China has to do is run some, larger deficits and direct those deficits towards its consumers.
Right.
And
And another,
it closes the gap in GDP. No problem.
and another thing I have to say when they say about Trump thinking, he's just receiving information from other people. I just really can't see him thinking and all that. It's not him. He's just taking what a bunch of people are telling him and repeating stuff.
Yeah.
Even so, it should be fairly obvious by now that the Liberation Day extravaganza was merely a way to conceal Trump's real motive, which was to formally launch a trade war on China. That's what's really going on behind the scattershot tariffs that have been haphazardly aimed at friends and foe alike. The real bullseye is on China, the greatest emergent threat the U.S. has ever faced. The embargo on Chinese goods suggests that Washington is finally making a definitive pivot to Asia. Ukraine is being handed over to the NATO allies while the U.S. shifts attention to the Far East. The administration is already committed to strengthening its military presence in the region, building support for anti-China coalition, inciting incidents in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, and now imposing a complete embargo on China without any prior notice and without the slightest provocation. You want to go down a bit
Yep.
or up a bit? What? No, the other way.
Oh, go up. Yeah.
The new tariff fits seamlessly with Washington's broader strategy of containing the one rival that is most likely to become the undisputed regional hegemon. In the Financial Times opinion, the U.S. does not have the aid, the technology, or the market access to exert control over global trade the way it once did, and Trump's erratic behavior is rapidly increasing the probability that it never will. Trump discovers the U.S. is no longer indispensable.
Yes.
But whatever Trump's intentions may have been, there is no doubt that the plan was poorly thought out and is not having the impact he had hoped for. For example, Trump thought his gigantic tariffs would send Chinese Premier Xi Jinping racing for the phone to see what concessions he could make to placate strongman Trump. But so far, that hasn't happened. It doesn't look like it will. Instead, China's foreign ministry has repeatedly stated that, quote, all unilateral tariffs must be removed before China will even talk to Trump. In short, China has left Trump with no choice but to capitulate now or watch as the U.S. economy goes into cardiac arrest. Check out this short list of recession predictions by some of the bigger names in finance. Goldman Sachs prediction raised U.S. recession odds to 45% for 2025 if reciprocal tariffs proceed. They expect a recession, albeit mild, similar to 2001's dot-com bust. JP Morgan prediction sees a 60% chance of a global recession by year-end 2025. CEO Jamie Dimon predicts tariffs will slow growth and boost inflation. TD Securities prediction raised U.S. recession odds to 50% due to, quote, blunter than expected tariffs. Moody's Analytics predictions chief economist Mark Zandi raised recession odds to 40%, calling tariffs, quote, fodder for an economic downturn. And Deutsche Bank prediction sees a meaningful increase in recession risks. Tariffs raise core PCE inflation by 1 to 1.5 points and reduce growth via higher cost and reduced competitiveness. Uncertainty and retaliation amplified downturn risk. Morningstar prediction calls tariff a self-inflicted economic catastrophe, predicting a recession with reduced GDP growth for 2026. Reasoning: tariffs raise effective rates to 20 to 25%, the highest since the 1930s Smoot-Hawley Act, increasing inflation and reducing consumer demand. Supply chain disruptions and retaliation worsen outcomes. So, while no one can predict a recession with 100% accuracy, there's a mounting consensus that tariffs are going to impact spending, inflation, and growth. The anticipated outcomes are simply baked in the cake.
Okay, so if I can add here uh, some of the pictures we've been seeing of the lack of shipping uh, coming into key ports in the Pacific. Seattle, for example, Los Angeles. Uh, I mean, it's scary. These are the kinds of pictures that we were seeing uh, in the, during the period when COVID was, taking hold here in the United States. If the disruption of the supply chains is anything like it was in terms of COVID, all these predictions of the kind of recession we are likely to see are far too conservative. Uh, when we saw the supply chains disrupted, okay, in COVID times, okay, it immediately sent the U.S. economy into serious tailspin and huge unemployment rates. Huge unemployment rates. So I have to think that the forecasters don't really have models that covered this kind of happening, this kind of disruption. And I think they have to be viewed as underestimating the likely effect in terms of a recession or depression. Just a hunch. Okay, I don't have a model myself to argue, with their models, but I'm pretty sure their models did not anticipate this kind of tariff situation. Now, Trump, of course, is likely to run the other way very quickly now. He'll try
Uh-huh.
to hide it, but he's going to run the other way because he sees he didn't expect this kind of failure and this kind of lack of satisfaction, with what he was doing, this kind of opposition. So he and the Republicans are, getting really, really scared. So over the next 2 weeks, we may see, uh, we may just see a total cave on the tariffs, and maybe that will bring back some of the supply chains fairly quickly. But I think most people agree we're going to see lots of empty shelves now pretty soon. I guess within about 2 or 3 weeks from now, we should see the empty shelves impact of that, really begin to hit. Please go on.
Okay, the Spectator Index says just in, the Wall Street Journal editorial board says that Trump's continues to walk back his original tariff assault and that China called Mr. Trump's bluff.
I'm sorry, did I scroll
Yeah,
fast?
yeah, yes.
Okay.
China called Mr. Trump's bluff and seems to have won this round.
Right. And there, of course, are Trump and Xi.
Yes. So, what should Trump do? Well, the data is clear that he has made a serious blunder that requires immediate action. He needs to acknowledge his mistake and make a course correction before the supply chain disruptions deteriorate and the hole he's dug for himself gets even bigger. He needs to remove the tariffs, comply with the World Trade Organization rules and regulations, and replace the members of his economic advisory team who concocted this madcap idea. We have to assume that it wasn't Trump who thought tariffs could be used to counter China's so-called, quote, unfair practices that, quote, hollowed out U.S. manufacturing. No, it was likely Robert Lighthizer, who is key architect of Trump's first-term trade war, and Peter Navarro, a former Trump trade advisor, who co-authored Death by China in 2011, and who influenced Trump's tariff policy during his first term. These are the brainiacs responsible for the current debacle. Trump is merely the unwitting accomplice implementing the destructive views of loony ideologues. We are reminded of a quote by John Maynard Keynes in his seminal work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, 1936, who made the following observation about the influence of deceased economist. The idea of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. While neither Lighthizer or Navarro are yet, quote, defunct, it's clear that Trump is in the grip of their misguided ideas. Here's a short sketch of both men. Robert Lighthizer who is key architect of Trump's first-term trade war and likely influenced the current tariff strategy, is a trusted Trump advisor whose protectionist views jibe with the majority of the other Trump appointees. Quote, Lighthizer views China as an economic adversary, exploiting globalization to undermine U.S. manufacturing. He advocates high tariffs, export controls, and decoupling to protect American industries and reduce trade deficits. $295 billion with China in 2024.
Oh,
His
that's
approach his approach prioritizes economic nationalism over military or ideological confrontation. Lighthizer's ideas directly inform Trump's 2025 tariff hikes, 125% to 245% on China, justified as countering China's, quote, lack of respect. What a bunch of you know what.
yeah.
Lighthizer's protectionism mirrors Smoot-Hawley's intent to shield U.S. industries, but ignores how such measures can deepen global economic strife. Robert Lighthizer remains an informal advisor in 2025, shaping Trump's tariff strategy through his proteges like Jameson Greer.
Okay, that comes from Grok.
Yes. Then there's Peter Navarro, who views China as a predatory economic power, stealing U.S. jobs through unfair trade practices. He advocates aggressive tariffs, export bans, and reshoring manufacturing to counter China's $640 billion trade advantage.
Okay,
Navarro's
yes, I see a little inconsistency there. The $640 billion trade advantage, but in 2024, the trade deficit was only 295 billion, according to the previous uh, paragraph.
okay.
So is it a $640 billion trade advantage or a 295 billion trade advantage?
Yeah.
Again, inquiring minds want to know.
He advocate yeah. Blah, blah, blah. Navarro's ideas reinforce Trump's 2025 tariff hikes and decoupling goals. Navarro's tariff heavy approach echoes Smoot-Hawley's protectionism, which backfired by deepening the Great Depression. Navarro's policies under Trump may disrupt global markets without a robust U.S. industrial policy, and that was Grok.
Yeah,
Finally,
yeah, Grok sounds like it's very sensible. Okay, there are ideas that have developed on the right, I've noticed over the last 20 or 30 years, where there are some writers who insist that the onset of the Depression of 1929, didn't have but too much to do with the tariffs. Okay, so there's a conjecture, running around about that. Uh, 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 Revisionism, okay, in history. So this leads some of the Republicans to think, well, maybe we should go back to tariffs.
oh,
And it's, part of their thinking on that score. And I suppose that's where Trump has picked up, some of these ideas. Anyway, go ahead.
finally, we have Stephen Moran, Chairman Council of Economic Advisors, CEA. Moran is a chief architect of Trump's tariff strategy, proposing a, quote, Mar-a-Lago Accord to restructure global trade using tariffs to force countries to, quote, pay tribute for U.S. military and financial dominance. Geopolitical Economy Report of April 10th, 2025. In an April 7th, 2025 speech, he called China, quote, our biggest adversary, and argued tariffs could win a trade war by leveraging U.S. consumer market power. He defended tariffs as historically successful, stating, quote, American economic history has spent periods of high tariff rates coincide with extraordinary economic successes. Note, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Kevin Hassett, Director National Economic Council, NEC, appear to be only minor players in the tariffs fiasco. These are the men whose ideas are driving the current tariff policy. The unfolding economic crisis can be traced back to them and their deluded views. St. Cupid.
Okay, well, now we know who to blame,
Yes.
right? Because so far, of course, it's been a disaster.
Patron saint of economic collapse.
Uh, yep.
Stupid.
Yes, ST period UPID.
Yeah.
The patron saint of economic collapse. That's very clever. Okay, let's check us out and see what's happened with respect. I see we have a few more people uh, going on here. We have a comment. Okay, Steve is shared on Facebook, and he says this from his perch on YouTube. And Evelina says, could Trump, oh, this is, I'm sorry, I should, uh, I guess I should be hiding that comment. Evelyn says, could Trump be setting up Kellogg for failure once the latest plan fails to secure a deal with Russia? Does Trump ultimately have another figure in mind for his plan B, okay, with Russia? I don't know, Evelina. I sure hope so. But why does he need to, have another figure in mind for his plan B with Russia? I mean, he already has his Witkoff. All he's got to do is throw his support behind him. All he's really got to do is stop spending on the war. If he stops all aid, okay, to Ukraine, I literally think the war would be over in 2 weeks. I think the Ukrainians would collapse. Joe Logan is here and says, hello, people. Trump is an idiot. Hi, Joe. China got where they are despite all competition. They got where they are by working real hard and outproducing everybody and outselling everybody. And they were greatly helped both in production and sales by U.S. people, those who wanted to buy their products and those who wanted to take their production facilities over to China and to produce things over there. Michael Kenya said, stock up on stuff, boys and girls. It's going to be like the toilet paper hoarding in 2020. That's probably good advice. I think I may go out and buy some toilet paper, Michael. I hadn't been thinking of that. I mean, we still have plenty in the normal course of events, but maybe we could use another 30 rolls from Costco or 36 rolls from Costco. I don't know where we'd put it all, but
Well, we all have to stock up. I mean, um, this is gonna, yeah, I don't think people really vision. This is gonna be horrible. Um,
well, I think what's going to happen, okay, is India is going to step into the breach and buy a lot of stuff from China, and then ship it to us. And so we probably won't have a big tariff on India, but the Indians will probably take a profit of 10% on the deal. So our prices will probably go up by 10%, which is going to be hard on people. I mean, it's, certainly going to be another, uh, price advance over and above the price rises we saw due to COVID, which have not, they've receded in certain areas, of course, but in certain areas like household goods and food, while things are no longer going up or going up only slowly, uh, they've never really gone down from the price levels before COVID. And we'll probably continue to see that, I think.
Well, I saw today truck drivers sitting down. They said they're just sitting there waiting
For supplies.
yeah, there's no supplies.
I know.
So it's a bad. And from what I also saw too was CEOs of Walmart stores, Walmart showing up in Washington, talking to Trump.
Oh, I know that's been going on for some time, and not simply Walmart, but other CEOs too,
Yeah.
all coming to tell Trump that the uh, tariffs are a disaster for them. So let's go on to our next piece. This one is on Sergei Lavrov. It's a short piece. It's from Larry Johnson, Sonar 21. And Larry says Sergei Lavrov conducts masterclass in diplomacy with CBS. And we're not going to play that, but the link to it, okay, is in the article. And okay, the YouTube, okay, is a YouTube part. Okay, something that Larry put out because he and a few others, he and the judge and a third guy, had a 3-on-1 interview with Sergei Lavrov about, I guess, 3 or 4 weeks ago. But this article is about the interview that Sergei had, with Margaret Brennan, the anchor, okay, of Face the Nation. And that was on the 27th, okay, of April, evidently. So Larry says, go get your popcorn and a stimulating adult beverage and watch it. Beyond the information value, it is damn entertaining. I posted it below. It is a remarkable display of skill and intelligence by Mr. Lavrov. I think this is the first interview of Lavrov by a major U.S. television network in 8 years, maybe longer. Finally, the Russians get to make their case in their own words to the American public. So here's a question. I thought this was the kind of question that our people should consider. So here's a question. Can you name a single American politician or diplomat with the status, okay, of Lavrov? Okay, so once you read that part of the sentence, it's already true. You cannot name a single American politician or diplomat with the status of Lavrov because there isn't one who has the status, okay, of Lavrov, who's probably considered by most to be the leading diplomat in the world today and for some very lengthy period of time. And there's nobody that comes anywhere near the status, among the Americans. Okay, and not there are not too many other people in the world that come near his status. But anyway, that could sit down with a Russian counterpart of Ms. Brennan and answer questions in Russian as Mr. Lavrov did in English. He was eloquent and articulate. More than that, though, he handled the gotcha questions with aplomb and at times, with humor. Hell, I can name a long list of American politicians, says Larry, who have confronted with the same kind of questions from Ms. Brennan, would have failed to answer as directly and coherently as did Mr. Lavrov. As you know, I had the privilege, along with Judge Napolitano and Mario Northau, of interviewing Mr. Lavrov for 90 minutes. The man you see on Face the Nation is the same one we met in Moscow. He ain't a bullshitter. He is armed with facts. He remembers history, and he provides genuine, eloquent answers. CBS recorded this interview last Thursday, I believe, and released it today. So last Thursday, and this was on the 27th. So, yeah, last Thursday was what, the 24th or the 23rd? This interview preceded the meeting of Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, with President Putin on Friday, as well as President Trump's brief chat with Zelensky prior to the funeral mass for Pope Francis. It appears that Mr. Witkoff presented Mr. Putin with the U.S. proposal to acknowledge Russia's claim on Crimea as legitimate, in exchange for Russia agreeing to an immediate ceasefire. Too little, too late. President Putin reportedly politely rejected that offer and repeated Russia's position that Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia are now and will remain part of the Russian Federation. Yes, Putin and Lavrov and Russia have been saying that for many, many months now, and there was no good reason to think that they would retreat from that particular position since they're winning the war, hands down. As I expected, says Larry, Mr. Witkoff also discussed the negotiations with Iran, and Mr. Putin explained what Russia was prepared to do to help the U.S. obtain a firm guarantee that Iran would not build a nuclear weapon. There was a glimmer of good news on Saturday after Witkoff met in Oman with Iran's foreign minister. Serious issues were discussed, and the two sides agreed to meet next Saturday in Europe. So that's that, April 4th, next Saturday, April 3rd. Okay. So Americans are expecting Russia to make concessions, such as accepting an immediate ceasefire along the line of contact or relinquishing their control of the 4 territories in eastern Ukraine, better change their expectations. Russia is not going to trust promises of the U.S. or the Europeans to do the right thing. Donald Trump needs to stop deceiving himself and insisting that he has had no role in the war now ravaging Ukraine. If you read my previous post, The Road to War in Ukraine, the history of NATO, and U.S. military exercises with Ukraine, Part 3, you can read for yourself that the U.S. and NATO stepped up its aggressive military posture towards Ukraine during Mr. Trump's first term. Not only did Trump supply Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, but the Pentagon approved anti-submarine warfare and amphibious warfare activities as part of the US-EU COM and NATO exercises. In addition, on September 4th, 2020, U.S. Air Force B-52 Stratofortress bombers entered Ukrainian airspace for the first time, conducting a long flight along the borders of Crimea. From Russia's perspective, Mr. Trump is neither an innocent nor a neutral party when it comes to negotiating an end to the war. Bonnie's sitting on the edge of her seat here right now. This week may be decisive if Marco Rubio is to be believed. Speaking on one of the Sunday talk shows, I don't normally believe Marco Rubio, but okay, if he is to be believed. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that the Trump administration will decide this week whether to continue pursuing a negotiated settlement in Russia's invasion of Ukraine or to turn its attention to other matters. Notice he only mentioned two options: pursue a negotiated settlement or turn its attention to other matters. Rubio said nothing about ramping up or restarting military support to Ukraine. I hope Rubio is correct. Without the United States facilitation, the Ukraine would be rendered impotent to continue and sustain its military operations. And there's a link to the interview Sergei Lavrov had with CBS, which I recommend to everyone, but will not play here. I mean, it's very interesting, but from our point of view, it doesn't contain any new information, since we've been relaying the things that Sergei Lavrov said to CBS for some time now. It's wonderful to see Sergei Lavrov get a chance to say it to CBS, and it's very good to watch the interview from the standpoint of appreciating how great a diplomat, Sergei Lavrov is, how talented, a diplomat. But from the standpoint of information, it's not as novel for us as some other information that we're about to get. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and I will go back to your comments for now. Oh, yeah. So Evelina reminds me it's going to be the 3rd of May. Yeah. Yes, it is the end of April now, so it will be the 3rd of May. Thank you, Evelina. Which reminds me, when I pay my rent in just a couple of days, we have to pay the increased rent, which for us each year starts on May 1st. So we have to increase our payment. I have to remember to do that. We can't forget. So here we are. Evelina says Iran / US. Yes, indeed, that is true. The next piece, is a video. I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'm going to start about 12 minutes in.
Wonderful. Well, I don't know where you got that. Where did you get?
Right. I'm going to start at about 12 minutes in. First 12 minutes are very, very good too. Here's where Larry starts talking about general matters of the history.
It only works for a short time. Have you seen his disapproval ratings? They're tanked.
Yeah, no, it's dropping. The approval rating is dropping.
I should point out, Larry Wilkerson is on your left. He, of course, is a colonel. He's a retired colonel, in the U.S. Army. And he was chief of staff for Colin Powell before Colin Powell came into the Bush administration, and while he was in the Bush administration as Secretary of State. After that, he became a professor at William and Mary College. Okay, and he's now a professor emeritus there. He's retired, okay, of course. Okay, as you'll see from his talking here, he was very qualified, to become a professor. He's very, very knowledgeable about all sorts of things. The guy on your right is Professor Glenn Deason. He's professor at southeastern Norway by university. And he's written a great book on the balance of power, the history of balance of power politics, okay, in nations, the history of the international system of that. And that book has gotten very good reviews. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But Glenn is, he's very quiet, a very understated guy. But he asks extremely good questions. And as you'll see, Kay, in this interview, he is wowed by Larry Wilkerson. Absolutely wowed. So here we go. I will do the usual thing we do here, which is I will stop this from time to time for commentary. And I'll have a lot of commentary on it, I think.
Yeah, approval ratings dropping, but I watch the disapproval more than I do the approval because there seems to be a disconnect in the way people poll these. Most of our pollsters, I don't know about yours in Europe, but most of our pollsters poll to prove something. They don't poll to find out what people think. They poll to prove something, and they have their preconceived notion when they do their polling. But the disapproval rating usually doesn't get their attention so much as the approval rating. So the disapproval rating is what I watch. And it's climbing. It's climbing. It's over, I think when I looked last, it was about 52 or 53% and headed up. So I don't know. I don't know if he pays any attention to that. It doesn't look like he does because he will go out and do something that just enhances whatever's happening in a moment. Either tell a lie or do something egregious with the economy. So I don't, I have to say, I can't figure the man out. I don't know where he is or what he's going to do on any given day. I know that he started out, and I think the only sane and sober member of the administration in a now, I guess, official special envoy status, he's really the Secretary of State. And I'm sure that I'm quite confident Trump did that on purpose because I don't think he likes Marco Rubio much. So he sort of put.
The he here he's talking about is Witkoff, Steve Witkoff, of course. And he's calling him, he's really the Secretary of State. Well, he's special envoy, and he's the one who's doing a negotiation with Iran and with the Russians now, and Marco Rubio was cut out of that. But Marco Rubio is, of course, the official Secretary of State.
Rubio in his place by putting Witkoff in every crisis on the face of the earth, virtually. Put him in Gaza, put him in Ukraine, put him in Iran. But he seems to be a stable person, and he seems to think logically, and he seems to have a little bit of wisdom, not much historical knowledge about what he's dealing with, which is a real problem. But nonetheless, he's willing to listen, as was indicated in Muscat the first time and the second time. He's willing to listen, and he doesn't take counsel for Mike Waltz, because Mike Waltz was putting it out that Witkoff was wrong, that nothing he told the Iranians in the first meeting, indirectly, nothing that he told them was right.
Okay, so we have to remember here, Mike Waltz is the national security advisor for Trump, and very much in the Zionist camp, and very much in the anti-Russian camp also. Witkoff decided from the beginning that he wasn't going to listen to those who were in those camps, that he was going to learn from the Russians himself, which is what he has proceeded to do, he being Steve Witkoff. Okay, so Mike Waltz was telling Steve Witkoff stuff, and Steve Witkoff decided to seek his own counsel and to try to understand what the Russian side of the story was. Okay, as any person who's a good diplomat, or a good businessman actually would do. If you're a good businessman and you're trying to sell somebody something, you always want to find out what their needs are, what their perceptions are, how they view the situation, because unless you understand that, you can't really sell them anything. So here we go again.
We were not going to do anything with Iran but disarm them, completely disarm them. If they didn't want to be completely disarmed, the talks were over. Well, Witkoff went back to the second meeting and didn't pay any attention to that at all. So we're going to have other meetings, apparently. Who knows what's going on, though, between Waltz.
Okay, so we're going to have a third meeting this coming Saturday. Okay. Witkoff has been talking to the Russians, and he's been talking to the Iranians. And what he does is each time before he talks to the Iranians, he goes to talk to the Russians first. And he talks about, both Ukraine, but, he also talks about Iran. So he's getting Russians' perceptions on it. And of course, as we all have to remember, Russia recently concluded a very comprehensive alliance with Iran on January 17th, and is certainly very, very much attached to Iran. And if any war breaks out, will likely give a great deal of help to the Iranians in various forms. People seem to agree they're unlikely to go in with troops on the ground, but they will provide all sorts of help to the Iranians in other ways, I'm sure functioning much the same way we've done, with respect to Ukraine, being that comprehensive in their support, for the Iranians. They've already provided them with a lot of air defense stuff. And a lot of other weaponry. They've been doing it for months now. So there's that to keep in mind.
And Rubio and Witkoff and Trump. Apparently, Witkoff only listens to Trump, and that's probably good. But then you got to ask yourself, what is Trump telling him?
If you've got pink salt and apple cider vinegar in your kitchen and you're not using this recipe, you're throwing away your chance to be summer ready.
Look at Ukraine right now. You have 4 significant issues that they're not really addressing in a logical way. You have the axis inside Ukraine. You have the axis between Kyiv and the EU. You have the axis between Washington and Kyiv. And you have the axis between Ukraine, Kyiv, if you will, and Moscow. You've got to deal with all 4 of those components roughly simultaneously. And you've got to take care of all 4 of those components. Well, all Trump seems to be doing, and apparently all Witkoff seems to be doing, is dealing with Putin and letting the other things just run around wherever they will run around. Well, that's not going to work because Putin's not going to sign up to a deal where the other 3 aspects are still perturbating the situation majorly.
So I thought that was a very good analysis, of Larry, of what the actual situation is, and of the difficulties that Witkoff is going to face if he doesn't take care of the other 3 components of the situation. And there's no indication yet that he's taking care of the other 3 components. He's spending a lot of time talking to Putin, yes, and he's, I think, beginning to understand some of the historical context of the problem he's facing now, with respect to the Iranians. But as Larry says, he's got to do more than that.
Just because we want a relationship with Moscow. I had a Russian ask me for a comment yesterday, and I essentially said, this is what I would think has to happen. And by the way, at the end of it, you have to have a significant effort that has picked up steam going towards a new security relationship in Europe that includes Russia. I called it a new Euro, whatever you want to call it, Euro-Asian security architecture. I don't like to put Asia in there. I'd rather say a European security architecture that includes Russia. And I don't see a lot of work on that right now, maybe because they realize the other three are going to mess it up. But I don't see a lot of work on anything. And Gaza, of course, if you want to get sick, watch Ben Gvir at Mar-a-Lago. Watch Ben Gvir extol in English at Mar-a-Lago. I love all you people. I just love you people. And what we're doing, you should see how we torture people. You should come to our jails, visit our jails, and see how we torture people. And people are clapping. People are sitting around this luxurious dinner table or whatever it was, and they're clapping. Now, I have to admit, I saw this morning some press reports and watched some video where he's gone around the country trying to do the same thing to audiences at various places in the country, and they've been pillorying him, and they've been throwing eggs at him and things like that. That's what should happen to Ben Gvir. In fact, he should be arrested and turned over to the International Criminal Court. But the administration's got so many irons in the fire and is doing so little strategically about those irons that I don't know where they're going. I simply don't know where they're going. I watched Doug McGregor on your show a little bit, and I agree with most of what Doug's saying, particularly the negative aspects of it. I don't agree that we had no strategy in World War II. Well, certainly we had a strategy. It was called, we're going to be the arsenal of democracy. And McNair and Marshall and others said, okay, well, that means we're going to have to limit our manpower in the field. And they put a limit on that manpower. And we almost paid for that with the Battle of the Bulge, the counteroffensive in the Ardennes, 1944-45. We took 78,000 casualties there. That was our strategy because we didn't want to take men completely away from the industrial base. We knew we could only make so many divisions and have that industrial base that would supply us, the Free French, the Free Poles, the Soviets massively, and the British. We did that. That was a very successful strategy because look what we did. Joe Stalin knew what we did. We used Russia to defeat Germany, in essence. And
Yeah, we have to supply the Russians too. Don't forget. We did a lot of supplying of the Russians in the Second World War.
And then we came ashore and almost lost it in that counteroffensive. Had Hitler gotten what he wanted with Model's Army Group B, if they had gone to Antwerp and taken Antwerp and severed the Canadians and the Brits and the Americans by taking the logistical port of Antwerp, we would have been kicked off the landmass. And that would have been, they might have still lost to the Soviets, but that would have been a hell of a defeat for Roosevelt and for Churchill. And Eisenhower was almost relieved of it because they knew he'd made a big mistake. And that's why we didn't go on to Berlin too, because it's so sour to Eisenhower that he didn't want to go into Berlin and do street fighting. He let the Russians do that. And what did we get? We got the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe and so forth. So it was a flawed strategy, but to say there was no strategy is pure nonsense. George.
I thought that short segment was really fascinating in terms of his viewpoint of what went on in the latter stages of the Second World War and the mistakes we made and the impact of those mistakes, on the post-war situation. But also there's the question of whether there really was mistakes, because putting a limit on manpower did allow us to do all those critical supply things that we did for all the other participants, of the war. So maybe that was a mistake, maybe it wasn't. It was like there was a trade-off there. It was hard to do the trade-off absolutely successful, but it was interesting to find out that Eisenhower was leery of doing the street fighting, okay, inside the cities, okay, in Europe. I hadn't understood that before, and I value Larry's perspective on this.
Marshall was Jack Pershing's chief of staff in World War One. We had a strategy in World War One too. It was not to be like the French and the British and use casualties as the mark of success on the battlefield. We didn't want to take massive casualties. Now, did Wilson have a strategy? Yeah, he wanted to make the world safe for democracy, and he was going to do that at Versailles, right? Yeah, right. Well, he didn't do that, and I agree with Doug on that. But let's don't say we didn't have a strategy. We did have a strategy. We don't today. We simply do not today. We have not strategic our imperial reign since Bill Clinton. It went away with H.W. Bush, Jim Baker, Dick Cheney, Colin Powell.
This is the quickest way to clear out stuck poop.
I have to poop. I
Okay.
feel stuck.
Sorry about that.
And the other people in that administration, most formidably Brent Scowcroft, who was a strategic genius. We haven't had that. So we've been absent leadership for decades.
Now that comment is a very, very important comment and a very, very important thing to understand. No strategy since the Bush administration. No actual foreign policy strategy, according to Larry Wilkerson. Not during the Clinton administration, also not during the Bush administration, where Larry and Colin Powell was serving, but still no strategy, and none from Obama, and none from Trump, and none from Biden, and still none from Trump. No real strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. No strategy since the 1990s. How can a great power, how can an empire have no strategy for 30 years and still survive?
How do you explain though the shifts in American presidents? Because during the elections, they all come off as well. I don't want to dismiss it as not being genuine, but let's, for example, look at Clinton when back in '94, in January of 1994, he was making the argument that if we expand NATO, we risk redividing Europe and making an enemy out of Russia again. So this would not be a good idea. He went on to do it anyways. And when Bush was elected, I remember the campaign he had. The whole a key thing was, we're not going to do nation building like Clinton did in the Balkans. We don't do nation building. And then of course he takes it on steroids in Afghanistan, Iraq, and
you
then
have to fool the American people. Well, to get elected, you have to fool the American people, or at least that's what both.
So you don't see it as necessarily being genuine, because when, like, again, Obama, I did buy into this when he had this campaign on change. We can't continue after, again, 2 Bush administration, we can't continue this change, and then yes, we can all again, this was also
I campaigned for him. I went right out of the Republican Party. I was still a Republican, still am today, but I campaigned for Barack Obama.
We gave him a Nobel Peace Prize because of his wonderful speeches. We fell for it as well, I guess.
That became his single mark of positive nature. He could give a good speech. But I will say, when I met with him in the Roosevelt Room in November 2015, which would have been the last year of his second term, the first words out of his mouth to me and General Paul Eaton, who was sitting to my left, were, "There's a bias in this town toward war."
Yeah.
And then he gave us a disquisition on how he got essentially talked into doing Libya by, he didn't say this, but we knew it, 2 ladies, Samantha Power and Hillary Clinton. And John Kerry was sitting right beside him, his then Secretary of State. And we asked ourselves, General Eaton and I, when we walked out into the West Wing reception room, we just had a photo op with him in the Oval Office. We walked out of the West Wing reception room and we said, was he talking to us to John Kerry or himself? And the general looked at me and said, I think all three. I said, I think you're right. I think you're right. Because Kerry at that moment, you may recall, was advocating for U.S. ground forces in Syria. And so the president took that opportunity to not only say he'd learned something in 7 years, there's a bias in this down toward the war, you bet, Mr. President. But he also was telling Kerry to shut his mouth in that indirect way in that meeting. And you could tell it from John Kerry's face. So Obama got fooled by a lot of people, and he got fooled, I think, most profoundly by his own confidence in himself. And it didn't work. I saw the same thing happen to Powell. Powell thought that he could handle anything, and he found out he couldn't.
So Obama was not optimistic about Libya, but it was Samantha Power and Hillary Clinton that swayed him.
I think that was the import of what he was saying. You remember he dispatched Samantha to the UN and got her out of Washington. And of course, John Kerry became the Secretary of State. I don't think he was happy with either one. I think he thought they had sold him a bill of goods, especially with regard to Libya. And those remarks that Hillary made rankle with him as much as they did with me, because we talked offline. We saw, he died. I said those are the most impolitic diplomatic remarks I'd ever heard uttered by an American supposed diplomat.
Yeah, accompanied by that chuckle, of course.
Yeah.
That particular remark by Hillary Clinton really struck home, with Bonnie, and I, as indicating just how horrible a person she really was. Yeah. And we still will often sometimes, talk about, that remark here because of the cavalier nature of it and the gleeful nature of it and the pleasure she was obviously taking, in the way that Gaddafi died. It was such a horrible death, a legendary death. And she precipitated it.
She thought it was funny.
Yeah, she thought it was funny. Okay, I understand the feelings she had, for Gaddafi, who was, really notoriously anti-feminist. I think she had a real passionate sort of hatred for him. But still, that remark, lack all, humanity, just. Anyway, going on.
No, that was not
I think she had rehearsed those lines. I think she was fully intent on saying that somewhere powerful in her interview.
Appearing like an iron lady, perhaps. I'm not sure where she was going with this.
Well, she was running for president. She'd been running for president ever since she left the first ladyship. And, I had to deal with her to a certain extent when I would go to the wrap-up meetings at the State Department, because the Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, Paul Kelly, was a good friend of mine, former Marine, good friend of mine. So I would go to the wrap-up meetings when I could in the evenings, 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and I would listen to what his deputy secretary said about the Senate and the House. And I would listen to the deputy for the Senate talk about how Hillary Clinton was one of the people in the Senate who could cross the aisle and deal with the other side very effectively. And I got this impression that, well, maybe she's a pretty good senator. And then later on in that time, about a year and a half later, I began to listen a little closer to what Jim was saying about the Senate. And I began to understand that she was on her track. She was running for president. And I think she got the blow of her life when she didn't get elected.
Do you want to know where to invest $1,000 right now? Well, forget about AI, quantum computing,
But I remember there were also being stories, it was in the New York Times, about the Obama. He wanted to withdraw from the wars, I think Iraq especially. But then his appointees from, I forgot which think tank, which dominated his administration.
Center for American Security.
Yeah, that they were able to sway him into continuing that war as well. Did you have any insights on this?
One reason they did it, Glenn, was because they knew what we were doing to build ISIS. We made ISIS. We made Daesh. We took out Abu Zarqawi. We took him out. He was the main man. What flowed into his death was Iraqi Sunni leadership, mostly from the Iraqi Republican Guard, who knew about artillery, knew about armored warfare, knew about how to coordinate air power. They were military, and they were pretty competent military. They were made incompetent in many respects by the leadership of Saddam Hussein and how he orchestrated and kept them on a leash all the time. But they weren't that bad a military, and they had good Soviet equipment. Well, what they did was make a deal with the CIA and with these remnants of, well, it was everything from Al Qaeda to you name it. It was a throw together group of terrorists that Zarqawi had put. Zarqawi was a poison maker up in the mountains, and suddenly he came down. I think he was a Kurd, if I remember right. Anyway, he came down, and Saddam Hussein didn't even like him. He was so bad. I learned all of this when I was getting Powell ready for the UN presentation. And they put together this organization that was going to, when the U.S. got out of Iraq in a way that they could, going to take Syria, going to take northern Iraq, going to, everything, the caliphate. They wanted a caliphate. Well, that was not what the Republican Guard members wanted. When you saw these guys firing accurate artillery rounds, when you saw them maneuvering tanks and everything, those weren't people who'd come from Al Qaeda or some other terrorist organization. Those are Republican Guard members from Iraq. So the CIA helped create that entity and flowed them into Syria so that we could destabilize Assad. We got a shock when the insurgency started in Iraq. The full plan was to go on to Syria. And we thought, the military thought, that Assad would back down immediately. All we'd have to do would be roll a few tanks across the border and he'd back down because he'd seen what happened to Saddam Hussein. Well, the insurgency developed so fast, Rumsfeld had to nix that. So we didn't go on to Syria. Wes Clark will tell you that we were going to Syria and then to Iran, and maybe some places else too. But all I ever heard was the briefing on Syria. And I also heard the briefing when we stood down. We weren't going into Syria and part of that was because Tommy Franks had not listened to Colin when Colin had told him, you need at least 250,000 troops. And if you're going to do all this, you need at least 250,000 troops. And you had the experience of the first Gulf War, where we had 600,000 plus. A lot of other people played in that one, including the Syrians and the French and the Saudis. And Tommy finally got angry at Colin, and he said back to him, listen, Rumsfeld was going to give me 50,000 total. I'm glad I got 160,000. And then Rumsfeld left that division hanging out there in the ocean for so long, 16,000 men, that was going to come down through Turkey, but the Turks balked at the last minute and said, no, you can't do that. You can't come in from the north. So we had to ship them around, and they stayed at sea for a long time. Rumsfeld wouldn't let them come ashore because he wanted to be seen as the man who done Saddam Hussein with as few troops as possible, and then do Bashar al-Assad too, because it was all shock and awe. Didn't work. And so there we were, thumb in mouth and no Syria going. And we developed an insurgency with the CIA. And long story short, we had to go back and fight our own developments. It was so bad, Glenn, that we actually had Marines shooting at CIA officers and CIA officers shooting at Marines in Syria because the one didn't know the other one was doing what they were doing. And the CIA was working with Al Qaeda too.
When did they get?
So he's giving you the inside of all this now. And he's really starting to get on to the foreign policy tools and the foreign policy instruments that we use. Kind of a general methodology for the exercise, okay, of power. And you'll see.
Out of control though, because I can see, the American intelligence agencies building up the these jihadist groups as an instrument in a proxy war. But when did the U.S. Well, I guess lose control over them and begin to attack them?
Well, when we had to come back, and they looked like they were going to make some significant progress, and we didn't think Petraeus had really.
Ever wondered what your home looks like from space? Enter your address and get a 360-degree satellite view of your home.
David Petraeus had told the president again and again and again that his training, remember, he started out as a 2-star, as the head of Minstiki, the training command in Iraq. And he was telling the president on civets almost every week that everything was copacetic, that all these people were getting really well trained and they were going to be capable of not only internal security, but also external security for Iraq. This in progress to our leaving eventually. Well, I was getting reports from my spy on the ground in Iraq that the AWOL rate in these battalions was sometimes as high as 30%. And I was getting other reports that said they couldn't shoot straight and they weren't all that good as soldiers. So, well, Petraeus was giving glowing reports back to the president. So we thought that the military Petraeus had been largely responsible for training and given such glowing reports to the president about was going to be able to handle whatever was left of any insurgency or whatever. And I'm not even sure the conventional military, the right hand, knew what the CIA, the left hand, was doing completely. So we had to go back because they became ground taking and ground holding units. And so we had to get, Obama had no choice. He had to send forces back into Iraq because the Iraqi army couldn't handle it. And they begged him to come back, which was really kind of rare. They wanted us out, and then to beg us to come back, that meant that they really did understand that their military was not competent to handle that. I mean, you're talking about a bunch of people who got together, trained a little bit, Republican Guard behind them and helping them, lots of equipment, lots of ammunition, lots of artillery and everything. But still, Iraq had the equivalent, but they were frightened. And so they called us back in again, and we've been there pretty much ever since. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare, and it's partly a nightmare because the empire doesn't know what it's doing from day one to day two. It's got so many people involved in the soup that it doesn't have any time to eat the soup.
So, do you have any information on the ground what's going on in Syria? Because this is, I guess, the United States wanted to use Jolani and his henchmen to put pressure and weaken the position of Assad. But did they really want him to end up where he's now, ruling over Syria? This is, I mean, can he be civilized or managed? This seems like such a, the way he was, have a bounty on his head, and next day, we go to, to cheer him on for creating a new democratic Syria. It's just it becomes very cartoonish after a while. Like this can't have been their first pick, I guess.
Some indication of how chaotic this was going to be occurred when Israel was really taking some losses, but nonetheless pounding Hezbollah. And all of a sudden, Netanyahu was asked by us to stop and to get ready for other action. And that other action, of course, was, and we told him this, was Syria. He was more than happy to do that. So he put an economy of force, holding force type element into Lebanon. And anyway, the ceasefire was coming about at that time, partly because of this. And he plunged into Syria. So we thought that Netanyahu, coveting as much of Syria as he possibly could get his hands on, and he was pushing well beyond the ski resort, the Mount Hermon, I think it's called, whatever, and well beyond the Golan that was already occupied into the southern Golan and on into Lake, River, Reservoir, and other places that he was investing because they want water. They want water wherever they can find it. That's one reason they want to stay in Lebanon. So Netanyahu joined the fray and became our tool in Syria to counter Erdogan, because we were really worried about, and we were talking to Erdogan, but we were worried about what he was doing and what he was saying in the talks. He was saying that all he wanted to do is take care of that element of the Kurdish population in Syria that was giving him trouble. And then he would be happy. He'd be pleased, and he wouldn't invest Syria anymore with troops. And Netanyahu was concerned too. You may recall Netanyahu and Erdogan met to talk about it. I'm not sure what they determined, but I think they gave themselves a division of labor, and Israel said it would continue to bomb everything that even looked like it might be a piece of ordnance in Syria, including in Damascus, which they've done several times. And they would take care of anything that needed to be taken care of if this guy moved in a way that looked like he was going to be inimical to either Erdogan's or Israel's interests, which Israel has done. They've had a couple of pretty vicious firefights with the IDF. His troops have. In each case, his troops have given a good showing, but they've been defeated by the IDF with some significant casualties.
The real reason you're stiff after sitting.
If you're over 50, I bet you know what old school tough.
That's one reason Trump is pulling us out. But you'll note that he said he was pulling us out 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we still aren't gone. We still got about 1,000 troops there, and they're kind of lingering.
Yeah, those are the troops in the northwestern part of Syria, where the oil is. And we are pulling out the oil from there, and we are giving it to the Israelis. And we have been doing that for some time in order to help out, with the Israeli war effort, because, of course, they need whatever oil they can get from anywhere. So we still have the 1,000 troops there. And by the way, those 1,000 troops are sitting ducks. If a wider war develops, they would be under serious attack from the Iranian missiles.
But it's a mess. Syria's a mess, but Israel is making hay in that mess. And I suspect you're not going to see Israel, if it stays together as a state, which is becoming increasingly a question, never leaving Syria again. They'll have quite a significant stretch of water-rich territory inside Syria, beyond the Golan Heights.
So when before the Turkish-backed jihadists invaded Syria, this peace deal, which was all a ceasefire, which was reached between Israel and Lebanon or Hezbollah. This was, you're saying this was coordinated with the United States?
Yes, it was. If you remember, Lloyd Austin was standing on the border with his equivalent in the IDF. I forget the general's name now, but he was standing there and he was saying, this is going to stop. We're going to have a ceasefire, and we're going to have delineated lines and all this, and this will no longer be a component that diverts Israeli soldiers from other things that they need to do, meaning Gaza, I guess. And then I found out that Austin didn't necessarily lie, but he knew that that wasn't the case, because he knew what was going to happen, and he knew that the ceasefire was coming about because we wanted Israel to, protect our six, as Assad was either toppled or fought fiercely back. And that was the reason that the ceasefire came about as quickly as it did, not because Austin and Netanyahu wanted it to, but because they wanted to divert forces.
This is fascinating. I just had a bit of a sidetrack. You mentioned earlier that the United States were pushing hard for Sweden and Finland to abandon their neutrality. How long was, again, they were neutral throughout the Cold War, and their military, especially in Sweden, they always, they were leaning towards wanting NATO membership, but both the population of Sweden and Finland were always
right.
Well, the majority was not in favor. How has
we knew that, and we started major efforts. They're still ongoing in countries like
Okay, here's where he really gets into the inside of how we operate with our foreign policy.
Did it start, or and how was this
Started in
done? The
2000
efforts.
It started in 2002. It started in my administration, and it started with a vengeance with Jens Stoltenberg. We wanted Jens Stoltenberg to be the new Secretary General of NATO, and we were absolutely committed to that.
Why?
Because we knew he was our man. We knew he was going to do what we wanted him to do. We knew he was in mind meld with us about NATO expansion. You know, we're talking about eventually probably every country.
Gabapentin is bringing you closer to amputation. These are 3 symptoms that are signaling that you could be
That we would say is geographically in Europe, no matter how small, no matter how criminal, no matter how undemocratic, every single country in Europe was going to be a member of NATO. And we needed a whole new game with regard to those who were holdouts, either for neutrality or just simply didn't have a population that wanted to be a member of NATO. So we started doing what we do in what we call color revolutions. They were orchestrated within the countries. Each country had its package, and that package consisted of everything from non-governmental organizations to quahogs, quasi-governmental organizations, to government organizations, visits from senators and representatives. That was a big part of the campaign. And they focused all of these things clandestinely and openly, like the visits by Senate and House delegations, focused on those people within the country that wanted to comply with our wishes, wanted their country to be a member of NATO, no matter how long they'd been neutral, perhaps, like in the case of some of the Scandinavians, wanted their country to be a vassal of the United States in order to get the stars on their shoulders and the tanks and the F-35s and all the other stuff. And it was very successful. We only failed, in my view, we only failed with 1 or 2 countries that we had on the top of the target list, principally because, and this is my guess on it, principally because the communist legacy was not like it was in other countries that had been behind the Iron Curtain, nor was it something that scared the Scandinavians or other countries that hadn't been behind the Iron Curtain. In 1 or 2 countries, it did that, and you got real welcome for NATO membership. In other countries, it didn't. I would say Viktor Orban in Hungary and maybe Slovakia are 2 of those countries where there wasn't this feeling that we've been under the yoke of the Soviet Union. We now don't want to be under the yoke of the Russians because they're no different. They just call themselves differently. And so we don't want that. And that made Poland, for example, and others want to be members of NATO, desperately want to be members of NATO, want to be dominant members of NATO. Some of these other countries didn't. So we lost on a couple that we tried this in, but we tried it in every one of them. It worked.
So listen to what Larry's saying. He's saying we interfered in the internal politics of almost every nation, of Europe, at least those nations that were not inside, of NATO. Starting in the early 2000s, we interfered in every one of those nations to get them into NATO, to join up, in a campaign that was remarkably successful. We went into each of those nations and we used various instruments and tools to build up the people who wanted to support the policies of the United States and the overall goal of joining up with NATO, and to make those politicians successful in the internal politics of all those other nations, so that we would have the final result of everybody coming into NATO and forming an alliance that would be opposed, okay, to Russia. An anti-Russian alliance from the early 2000s. Wholesale interference in the internal politics of those countries, using various propaganda instruments, the NGOs. Larry's about to get even more explicit about that.
Famously in Montenegro, it worked famously in Albania. I said to Powell, why do we want criminal states in NATO? Albania is it's a criminal state. Montenegro steals more automobiles than are stolen in the United States. What the hell are we doing? How can they pass NATO's credentials for membership? I don't know, he said. But we did. We brought them in, and we orchestrated these campaigns to get what I call tyrannies of the minority. We found the political minority, not the political majority, that wanted NATO membership, desperately wanted NATO membership, and we backed it to the hill. We bought newspapers, we bought magazines, we bought articles, we bought same thing we did in Italy in 1948 when we didn't want the communists to be elected. We bought the Italian government. We bought the Iranian government in 1953. We bought the government in, where was it? Guatemala, 1954, and on and on and on. Well, this was much more sophisticated. This is not CIA agents per se doing this. This is CIA orchestrated campaigns that are run by non-governmental organizations, sometimes wittingly and sometimes unwittingly.
Yeah, the NGOs, the so-called NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They were the tools. And what were they selling?
It's what we use for Georgia, for example. It's what we're using right now in Georgia, trying to get the current government eked into its political leadership. And then we're trying to get them kicked out. And we're trying to get the government that was there before back in, because they're the ones who want to, stand up to Russia, be a member of NATO and so forth. But this government that's in right now is very balanced. They want a good relationship with the EU, good relationship with Washington, good relationship with NATO, and a good relationship with Moscow. We don't like that. So we're trying to get them overthrown.
So we're planning right now and implementing right now, interfering in the politics of Georgia to try to get a regime in there which is going to create yet another crisis with Russia. That's going on right now. It's going on under Trump. I'm sure Trump doesn't understand it because he's trying to work for peace with Russia. He probably doesn't understand what's going on in Georgia. But his deep state is working in the way that it has worked, at least for the last 25 years or so, and maybe longer, to keep on surrounding Russia. Some more talk like that.
That's how we do business today. We don't do business with direct action. We do business with direct action through NGOs and others who, as I said, are sometimes witting and sometimes unwitting. The ones associated with the Republican Institute are most often witting.
And I guess the National Endowment for Democracy would be one of these key NGOs.
That's a big one. That's a big one.
Yeah.
NED. And you got others too that you don't even think are doing this sort of thing, like FDD. And they're doing it, of course, on behalf of not just the United States, but also on behalf of Israel. Because this is all kind of locked in to where you get multiple parties participating in the planning and the propagandizing. For example, Mossad and the CIA together. You better believe Mossad's in Ukraine.
The first signs of sciatic nerve decay may surprise you. Most people don't know this, but the real reason behind searing.
And was this also the approach towards Ukraine? I mean, we don't even have to go to 2014, but even back in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, because this was done quite blatantly. I remember Yushchenko then back then he even called the EU and the godfathers of the godfather of the Orange Revolution. You had a lot of the interference was quite open, and I guess the Rose Revolution in Georgia 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, these were really, they were quite extraordinary because there were genuine discontent which could be tapped into on the ground. I mean, there's corruption, democratic deficits, a lot of reasons why you would demonstrate against the government, but the willingness to join NATO, every polling put it about 20%. Nobody wanted to be a part of NATO, but any discontent about corruption, whatever, was hijacked for a very geopolitical objective, which was let's join NATO and against the Russians. But the vast majority of Ukrainians, they preferred to have security arrangements with the Russians, not with NATO. This was, and it was just an extraordinary thing to happen. But again, in this media as well, in this country, it was all sold back then as being a huge democratic development. But it's a democratic revolution. Of course, it failed because the Ukrainians never wanted that government. And then we had 2014 again, 10 years later, do the exact same thing, but of course more vicious, purging old opposition. But what were your experiences from 2004, the whole Orange Revolution in Ukraine?
I had a CIA agent tell me, Larry, there's never been a weapon or a tool or an instrument of national policy as potent as us now, because we have liberal democracy on our side. Now, think about that for a minute. They had weaponized liberal democracy, and they used all these institutes and other people who were vested heavily in what they were doing, country by country, to implement liberal democracy. And as he said, it is a very powerful weapon, probably the most powerful weapon we've ever picked up. And I think that was a description with nuances all across Europe of what we were doing and what we're still doing. As I said, in Georgia, we just messed up in Romania. We didn't mess up, we succeeded. We got Colin Georgescu out. He was the one who preliminarily looked like he was going to be the new Romanian leader. So we got him out. He's gone. I don't know exactly how we did it, but I know we did it because someone called me and told me they were going to do it, and we did it. And he was gone. I was on that week, I was supposed to call him to talk to him because a person I know really well knows him really well, and he was getting real cold feet. And he wanted me to talk to him and to try and beef him up. And I said, what the hell am I going to say to, I don't know him from Adam. How am I going to beef him up in terms of his staying around? Well, he says, well, they're going to destroy him. They're going to get him. I knew they were going to get him, and they got him. That's, were they doing that in 2004 in Ukraine? They didn't have to be quite that straightforward about getting rid of people in 2004. But yes, we were running people from European command down into Ukraine as early as 2005 and 2006 to begin to work with, ready for this, the Azov battalions and others like that, in order to ensure that we were operationally capable of melding intelligence. And
this is all incredible, of course. He's really giving you the underside of U.S. foreign policy here. If you remember, the Azov battalion is the group of neo-Nazis inside of Ukraine. They are the remnants, of the Banderite movement that, in World War II was slaughtering Jews and other ethnic groups working on the side of the Nazis. After the Second World War, the CIA kept them alive. And in one way or another, they've been receiving some support from the deep state since that time. And they were instrumental, in the revolution in 2014 and, in Ukraine. And we're still dealing with them today. Some elements of our government still dealing with the Azov battalion, and the Banderites. There's some people who think that Zelensky won't make peace now because he's convinced that the Banderites in his government will kill him if he accedes to the Russians, and he doesn't feel that he'd be able to avoid that. I'm not saying that's the situation. I'm saying that may be what he appears to believe.
And arms and other things. And we even had a 4-star general who liked to ride big bikes, Harleys in particular, who occasionally would, as a 4-star general, get on his bike and go riding and do coordinating. This was all happening before the really tense period of 2014 when, we took sides so blatantly it was pitiful. We were working on it all along.
But some of this instrument for regime change or color revolutions, as they were called, has some of this been dismantled now? Because Trump, he had this defunding,
That's
and
a huge question.
yeah,
that's a huge question. I asked the other day if Tulsi, as DNI, and Ratcliffe, I was told Ratcliffe is in on all this. He's in favor of everything that's going on. So I said, well, you're telling me Tulsi's not and Ratcliffe is? How the hell is she going to turn him around? No answer. If Ratcliffe is neocon par excellence or whatever he is, but is intent on keeping all of these things going come hell or high water, and boy, do I know about the CIA keeping things going when the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense don't even know they're doing it. That's the common practice now. And the director will come back and say, well, we've got to give the president plausible deniability. You mean you're killing people without the sanction of the President of the United States in a formal decision memorandum, in a presidential finding or something? You're killing people on the ground in a foreign country? No comment. And it goes on from president to president because the president doesn't have any clarity on what's happening on the ground with the CIA, and the CIA has become its own independent actor within the national security establishment.
Well, folks, the day we've been waiting on has finally come. National Concealed Carry Reciprocity is here.
And people warned about this. People warned about this when we created the DNI too, and thought the DNI would be the person that would, consolidate power and be uncontrollable by the president. But the DNI has never been given money and people power. Trump promised to do that with Tulsi, but as far as I know, he hasn't done that yet. If you don't have money, if you don't have control over the budget, and the black budget too, and you don't have control over people, that is, you can't move people per their cleverness, their talent, their agility, whatever, from the CIA to INR at state, or from INR at state to the DNI office or staff or the CIA or whatever. If you can't do that, then how powerful are you? If all you can do is pontificate, how powerful are you? Now, Trump promised to give Tulsi because she knew that, and she made it a condition of her hiring for the position that he give her money and people power. And I have seen no indication of that. Ratcliffe is doing whatever the hell he wants to do, and Tulsi's not really supervising. And what Ratcliffe is doing is anything but, I think, what Trump would have him doing were Trump to be aware of it. So we've just got a colossal mess is what we've got, a typical kind of mess when an empire gets to the end. And no one knows how to control it. No one knows how to stick their finger into the pie and say, nope, pull that cherry out, go away. You can't do it anymore because it's gotten too big and too out of control. And too much money flowing into it. Money, incidentally, that's only coming from the printing presses. Ain't nothing behind it.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it right there, okay, and look at your comments. But I thought that Larry's commentary was so insightful all through, so revealing about the very complex ways in which things, okay, are happening and have happened for the last 20 to 30 years. I should mention here, Larry Johnson recently did a 3-part series in which he detailed the collaborative events, okay, inside of Ukraine, I believe starting in the year 2000 and going up to the present. And he did a decade by decade description of the various collaborative events involving the United States and Ukraine, okay, and NATO, so that you see from the beginning, from the 1990s, in fact, how we were grooming Ukraine to build up its armed forces, to use them as a proxy, against the Russians. It's a fascinating little series. It's at Sonar 21, so I recommend you go and check that out as well. But that supplements, what Larry Wilkerson is saying here in fine detail with respect to one case, specifically the Ukraine case. So I'm going to leave that now and go to your comments. Okay, Dee, have you got anything to say about this?
No. Let's see what the comments say.
Okay, let's see what the comments say. Okay. Okay, so Evelina, last comment we read was Evelina's a comment at 10:21. So Fry Steve says NATO would be better off without Hungary. Okay. Earl of Laurel says, hi guys, hi Steve. Fry Steve says, KGB Colonel Putin has been interfering in countries since early 2000. The Party of Regions is funded by the Kremlin. But I think you have to admit, Fry Steve, that Putin is a piker compared to the United States in terms of interfering in the internal affairs of other nations. And we are certainly the masters of that. Fry Steve says, 2014, the referendum passed to join EU. The people weren't trying to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Okay. This is the narrative of Putin, and history doesn't support it. I don't agree. I think that I'm not talking about what the people were trying to do or what they were not trying to do. What I'm talking about is the joint efforts of Ukraine and the NATO nations and the United States, since the 1990s. Okay, these were the governments of Ukraine and the elites, okay, of Ukraine who were involved in the common efforts. And what the people wanted was another thing. Evelina says, Georgia, Slovakia, and Serbia still standing firm against imposition of the U.S. Don't know what Hungary had in mind inviting Netanyahu. I'm not sure what they had in mind. Farsi says the Azov Battalion were football hooligans that responded to fight the Wagner Group, who are neo-Nazis. You always seem to forget that the Wagner Group are neo-Nazis. Well, I don't forget. I just don't agree with you that they were the neo-Nazis. I mean, the neo-Nazis are the Banderites. And the Banderites are the Azov Battalion. They're the ones who are wearing the insignias. And they're the ones who adhere to the Nazi ideology. I mean, certainly the Wagner Group are not neo-Nazis because, in no way are they anti-Slavic. Putin was part of killing protesters in Georgia. Georgia doesn't want to stand with Russia any more than the United States. Their leadership has been propped up by the Kremlin, just like ours currently is. Well, that's your view, Friar Steve. The Orange Revolution was against the corruption of the government sponsored by Russia, Party of Regents. This was the handiwork of Paul Manafort. Even he says, yes, Dr. Joe, disgustingly revealing. This commentary is like right out of the mouth of Tucker Carlson, who got it directly from the Kremlin when he went to get his training in Moscow. Colonel Wilkerson doesn't come from Tucker Carlson, okay, or from Moscow. He comes from the military through the Bush administrations. Has nothing to do with the Kremlin. There's no funding to support this narrative. There's direct funding to support the proxy war by Putin in the Donbass and Crimea. No doc interfered in our elections. That's how we got the current administration. Friar Steve, that's so much bullshit. The way we got the current administration is because of the failure of the Democrats to deliver for people over a period of many, many years. That's how Trump first got into the presidency, and that's how he's gotten into the presidency again. The Biden administration failed to deliver for people. That's a fact. And they got themselves embroiled in a war they had no business doing. They collaborated with Democratic centrists who were bought by the billionaires, and they themselves were bought by the billionaires. That's why Medicare for All never got through. That's why a federal job guarantee has never gotten through. That's why the Green New Deal has never gotten through. Trump won in 2024 because of the failures of the Biden administration. Trump won in 2016 and in 2024 because the Democrats blocked Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020. Earl of Laurel says, Friar Steve has been drinking the Kool-Aid. He sure has. Doc, where do you think the Wagner came from in the Wagner Group? It's a Nazi organization. I understand the connection between the Wagner terminology, okay, and Nazis, but the Wagner Group was not full of Nazis. It's not a Nazi organization. It wasn't then. It's not but today. Friar Doc, every single word is directly what the Kremlin once said. That's very clear. Well, the fact that the Kremlin may agree with a lot of what we're saying doesn't make what we're saying untrue. I'm afraid the facts are in favor of many Kremlin interpretations. We can see that, okay, in the Ukraine failure, the lack of realism on the part of American administrations, the lack of willingness to face the decline in power of the United States, the lack of willingness even at the military level, to accept that there's been a failure of planning, from the U.S. military. When I say a failure of planning, failures on the part of the U.S. military, in spite of, their lavish funding, they have air defense systems that are inferior to Russia's air defense systems. Our drone technology is inferior to their drone technology. Of course, we don't have hypersonic missiles yet. They're producing them in quantity and have been doing it for a long time, and they've been spreading around the technology to their allies. No hypersonic technology, nothing like the Oreshnik. I haven't even begun to talk about the Chinese technological advances in military science. We don't have any of that. That means in spite of all the money that we've sunk into them, the military industrial complex has failed us from a competence point of view. Paul Manafort worked for the Kremlin. Trump won. The same Manafort helped the party regents win. He also gave polling data to Russians from Trump. So what? This is a direct link between his political party and the Russians. It's as collusion as it can get. That's not the issue. The issue is the effectiveness of all this. What it had to do with Trump's winning. I tell you, the most important factor in Trump's winning was the failure of the Democrats to nominate Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020. Instead, they ran people who were unpopular and who were representing the billionaires and who didn't want to do things for the people. Putin said 2 + 2 = 4. We have to give up, math now. Okay. So Friar Steve says, I've talked to dozens of youth activists in Ukraine. Doc, your narrative is only from the Kremlin. Do you think the Russians also ran the Bernie movement? No. Not everybody that opposes Russian interference is working for the U.S. government. Oh, I agree. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about why Trump actually got elected. You think it's because of Russian interference. You need to examine your thinking. It wasn't because of Russian interference, because of democratic failures. And it doesn't start with Hillary Clinton in 2016. There were important failures in the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration was allied with the emerging oligarchs. And when Obama took over, he protected the oligarchs. He protected Wall Street from the pitchforks. He failed to deliver for people. He sabotaged the movement for Medicare for all. Doc, the effectiveness is he won twice. That's pretty effective. He cheated his way into power in Ukraine twice as well. No, he didn't win. Trump won. Why did Trump win? I'm telling you why, and you're refusing to see it. But, okay, that's enough. I'm not going to let you hijack this stream any further. We do have enough time, I think, to handle the final piece, which was not originally scheduled. But Dee, I think it's your turn. And we have a piece about what really happened at Bandar Abbas. And that's by Mike Whitney.
Okay.
And it's from UNS. And it's right here. It's brand new, April 29th. It's a short 800-word piece.
Okay.
Cover it before we end.
All righty.
And you're seeing the huge explosions now.
Iranian MP Mohammad Siraj claims that the massive explosion at Bandar Abbas was a deliberate act of sabotage. Siraj told Rokna news agency that, quote, Israel was involved in the explosion. It was not accidental. Clear evidence points to Israeli involvement. The MP claimed the blast, which killed at least 70 people and left 1,200 more severely injured, was caused by explosive pre-planted in shipping containers that were remotely detonated by either satellite or timer. Siraj explained that the explosions occurred simultaneously at 4 different locations, a theory that seems to be supported by aerial photos that shows fires breaking out at least 3 separate locations. Siraj also claimed that the planting of the explosives may have involved Iranian operatives assisting Israel. The Iranian MP was unable to provide any hard evidence to support his allegations, and his interview was later removed from the Rokan website. Even so, the incident at Bandar Abbas is not only familiar, referenced the 2020 Beirut port explosion, but also appears to have been strategically timed to coincide with the third round of the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks in Oman. Yes, a lot of people thought that as well. A video shared on social media shows the moment a huge explosion struck Rajay port in southern Iran and the powerful blast wave that followed. And it's Israel's pattern of behavior.
Absolutely, Israel's pattern of behavior. I agree this was probably Israel. Okay, the Israelis are very effective at this kind of thing, and that's an important part of their power, of why they have continuing power. They're very, very good at special operations of this kind.
Also, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it quite clear that he does not want to see the peace talks progress unless Iran is stripped of its defensive ballistic missiles and further isolated in the region. Given his support for a, quote, military solution, it is conceivable that Israel may have had a hand in the giant blast that not only killed scores of people, but also obliterated a large section of Iran's biggest container port. The prevailing narrative in the MSM, mainstream media, is that the port was being used to store solid fuel for Iran's ballistic missiles. The subtle implication being that, quote, missile fuel is a legitimate target whether those missiles are used in self-defense or not. Here's a clip from the Times of Israel. The New York Times quoted an individual with ties to Iran's IRGC speaking on condition of anonymity to discuss security matters, who said that sodium perchlorate had exploded. The compound is a major ingredient in solid fuel for missiles. The port had taken in a shipment of the chemical in March, the private security firm Ambry said a day earlier. The fuel was part of a shipment from China by 2 vessels to Iran. First reported in January by the Financial Times. Iran's defense ministry denied the reports that the blast may have been caused by the mishandling of solid fuel used for missiles, with a spokesman telling state TV that the reports were, quote, aligned with enemy psyops, and that the blast hit area did not contain any military cargo. Times of Israel. Notice how the, quote, missile fuel allegations are subtly embraced while the claims of the Iranian MP are discarded as speculation. And while we have no insider knowledge that would confirm either theory, we think the media's bias is apparent. Naturally, Iranian officials are denying the missile fuel claims to avoid any admission that Israeli intelligence have penetrated their ranks and provided them with access to critical military assets. On Sunday, Iranian spokesman General Reza Talenik delivered a forceful denial that missile fuel was the source of the blast. Quote, no sort of imported and exporting consignment for fuel or military applications was or is in the sight of the port, he told state television by telephone. He called foreign reports on the missile fuel baseless. There's been very little additional information on the explosion since the initial flurry of reports. That has not, of course, dampened public interest or lessened the amount of speculation. Without the facts, we cannot say definitely, quote, what or what did not happen, but that should not stop us from speculating on the meaning of an incident that in my mind, could reshape the Middle East and the world. Let's say, for example, that, for whatever reason, the Iranian government was using Bandar Abbas as a, quote, in parentheses, temporary strategic reserve for its ballistic missile fuel, solid fuel, what one analyst called, quote, a vital artery for the regime's regional proxy wars, as well as its own self-defense. Now, these critical reserves have gone up in a poof of smoke and will be unavailable in the event of a U.S.-Israeli attack sometime in May or June. This could, in fact, represent a catastrophic blow to the government and gravely undermine its ability to defend the country from an impending attack. In short, Bandar Abbas could be to Iran what the exploding beepers were to Hezbollah. We hope that it is not the case, but we fear that it could be.
Okay, that's it. I think this article is a significant sort, of speculation. When I saw it, the first thing I thought of was, why would they be storing something vital for solid fuel at a port for such a long time?
Mm-hmm.
It arrived, in March. If what they had there was so significant for their missiles, why weren't they moving the reserves to their underground tunnels, where they would be protected?
Mm-hmm.
I don't say, that explosive materials were not there, but I suggest that perhaps they were reserves for later on, and not, for any immediate use. So I doubt that they would be significant in the event of a U.S.-Israeli attack sometime in May or June. I suspect that the fuel necessary to respond to such attacks have gone into the underground tunnels long since, and are still there, and are still available for defense. I could be wrong about that, but I just can't understand why they would allow that stuff to sit in warehouses far from the tunnels for so long. I mean, it's, after all, it's been sitting there then for a month or so. That doesn't make any sense to me. So that's, anyway, my first reaction to this piece. But it certainly is information about what happened there. And so it's something that we all ought to, be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go back and see if we have any more comments. No. So Friar Steve says, Doc, Trump won by 1% in this last election. 3 million votes were deleted. Okay, that were Democrats. They cheated again. Yeah, they did cheat. And that was one reason why Trump actually won. But again, I come back to the main reasons. Those were marginally effective reasons. The reason why the Democrats didn't win by a landslide in 2016 and 2020 was because the Democrats were serving the oligarchs in both of those elections. Had they not sabotaged the effort of Bernie Sanders, and had been had he been elected as president, we'd be looking at an entirely different situation here in the United States now, an entirely different situation in foreign policy, as well. Frosty says Iranian civilians have some of the best conspiracy theories you'll ever hear. Is it possible it was just an accident? If it was sabotage, why won't there be any government that makes that clear? I guess there are many reasons for that. I don't even want to speculate about that because there are so many reasons why a government, would not want to make that clear. Friar Steve says, interesting article. Thank you. Then he says, just my observation, but if this explosion was conducted by Israel, Iran should rethink any conflict it may desire with Israel. Well, not if Iran is still ready for anything from the Israelis. In other words, that assumes that their capacity to retaliate or to attack first, was harmed by the explosion. What I think is that it wasn't harmed by the explosion because the necessary fuel for a major attack by the Iranians has long since gone into the tunnels and would not be sitting in a warehouse somewhere. I think that insofar as this involved any chemicals necessary for solid fuel, it was probably something they were going to use, 6 months down the road or more. I don't think it has anything to do with immediate significance. I might be wrong about that, but it doesn't sound sensible to me. Earl says, it's about my bedtime. I'll catch you guys soon. Thanks for the show. Well, thank you, Earl of Earl. It's, I think, about the end of the show anyway, isn't it, Dee?
Yes, it is.
So
Late.
It's 11:54, so it's certainly time to say goodnight. Okay, so Tommy F. and Oliphant says good night. Well, thank you very much.
Yes, good night.
Okay, good night. And good night, Dee.
Good night, Bonnie.
Thank you for coming.
It was a great show.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Oh, well, thank you. Okay, Evelina, thank you very much as well.
Yes, good night, Evelina.
I will see you again on Saturday, and I'm sure Dee will have some shows coming up on Wednesday and Thursday and perhaps on Friday as well.
Yes. Yes, I should. Madeline, I'm not sure what day Madeline is going to be on, but Thursday night is Harshmed.
Okay. Okay, do you know what you'll be talking about with Harshmed?
It's going to be various.
Okay.
We go all over the place.
Various conversations.
Yes.
Okay.
So much going on.
Okay, do you know what you'll be talking about with Madeline tomorrow night?
I'm not sure yet, but I'm sure she, well, I shouldn't really say I'm sure, but yeah. I know we do want to get into talking about Latin America, but a lot of times other things come up that kind of gear us away. But yes, that's why I don't want to say anything.
Okay, good night, Friar Steve.
Good night, Friar Steve, and good night, all.
Okay, and good night, all. And we'll see you next time.